down.
Hi everybody, this is DAI Heidelberg online, channel DAI Home, free of charge. Donations are welcome. We're very happy today to have a special guest, the famous linguist, the laureate professor who taught at MIT half a century and is now teaching at Arizona, the renowned political dissident Noam Chomsky, who joins us for a conversation from his home in Tucson, Arizona, where he is sheltering with his wife, Valeria. Hi, Noam.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. Today, the United Nations celebrate the Human Rights Day, while we face their erosion. And the Doomsday Clock shows about 100 seconds before 12. So all data seem to say rebellion or apocalypse. What is your advice for us?
We're in a very unusual moment, a unique moment in human history. The Doomsday Clock, which you mentioned, illustrates it. As I'm sure you all know, every January the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists brings together distinguished scientists, political analysts, try to give an assessment of the security situation in the world. They've been doing it since 1947. It's encapsulated in the Doomsday Clock. The minute hand is a certain distance from midnight. Ever since Trump was elected, the minute hand has been moving closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it reached the closest point it had ever been since 1947 when it was initiated. This last January, they abandoned minutes and moved to seconds. As you say, it's now 100 seconds to midnight. Midnight means terminal disaster. Since January, Trump has been acting in ways which move the second hand even closer to midnight. Recall that there are 3 issues that the analysts focused on. One is the increasing threat of nuclear war. Trump has since escalated the threat. He had already abandoned the INF Treaty, has now abandoned the Open Skies Treaty, which goes back to Eisenhower. The last treaty is the New START Treaty. The Trump administration has imposed frivolous conditions on any negotiation to ensure that it will not be settled. Meanwhile, they're developing new nuclear weapons. The Trump administration is calling for a new nuclear tests for the first time in 28 years, violating that treaty. Second issue is the enormous risk of growing environmental catastrophe. Trump has been escalating that perfectly openly, incidentally. In his February 2020 budget proposal for the next year, he called for, this is while the pandemic is raging, he called for continuing to reduce funding, as he's been doing for the last 4 years, to continue to reduce funding for the Center for Disease Control and all health-related elements of the government, and to increase subsidies for the fossil fuel industries and, of course, for the military. Meanwhile, his administration is making use of the pandemic cover to eliminate regulations which somewhat mitigate the effects of global warming and protect Americans from the lethal effects of pollution. So that's increasing. The third issue that they raised was the deterioration of democracy. At first, that sounds as if it doesn't belong with the two existential threats, but it in fact does, because a vibrant, functioning, participatory democracy is the only possible hope for escaping from the two major threatening disasters. Well, what's Trump been doing on that? Tearing to shreds the remnants of American functioning democracy. He has already eliminated from the executive branch any independent voice. All that is left is cowardly sycophants. There are inspectors general established by Congress to monitor executive branch corruption and malfeasance. They were beginning to look into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington. He fired them all, eliminated them. They're purged. Today's news, look at the newspaper, he wants to purge the Pentagon of anyone who is not sufficiently loyal to him. This goes step by step, trying to eliminate the formal aspects of functioning democracy. Democracy doesn't rely on laws. British democracy is 350 years old. The Constitution is maybe a dozen words. It relies on trust and good faith. If you don't have those, you can have beautiful Constitution the way Stalin did. It doesn't make any difference. This is dismantling every component of functioning democracy to try to turn the country not towards fascism. Fascism is well above Trump's comprehension level. That was an ideology, you couldn't understand that. This is turning the country into a small tin pot dictatorship of the kind you find in neo-colonial societies where there's a coup every couple of years. And it's run by a megalomaniac whose only interest is himself. That's the objective. And it's being carried forward. So if the Doomsday Clock were set now, second hand would move closer to midnight. What can we do about it? Almost everything.
Right.
Europe does not have to capitulate to this. Europe has so far been so cowardly that it capitulates to every move made by the Trump administration. He tore to shreds the Iran nuclear deal, which was working very well, raising the threat of a growing threat of war in the Middle East, a severe threat. Europe doesn't like it, but they go along with it. They don't do anything to object to it. And this is the case. The same is true of everything else.
Noam, it's so shocking in a way. You mention nuclear power, but in fact, in none of the newspapers we read, we ever see that kind of headline, the threat. We see another headline, that's racism at the moment. We see Black Lives Matter. We see the argument of full prisons. We see many other signs of riots. We see police force questioned. Why is the nuclear threat so invisible?
It's invisible here too. I mean, you can find discussion of it in the arms control journals. Occasionally you'll see a report, but basically nothing. In fact, it's rather striking that in the campaign that is underway in the United States, which of course has enormous publicity, there's almost no mention of any of the three things that the Doomsday Clock registered. Almost no talk about the growing threat of nuclear war, even very little commentary on the growing environmental catastrophe, which is quite serious. The racism issue is not a small point, and what is happening is very significant. The demonstrations around the country, overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, enormous public support, are completely unprecedented. There's been nothing like them in scale, solidarity, like Black solidarity, popular support. And it's a very belated recognition, beginning of a recognition of 400 years of vicious repression, which has left a very bitter legacy, not just police violence. So I mentioned that Trump is eliminating regulations on emissions, carbon dioxide and other emissions. Well, they happen to poison the atmosphere. We're in the middle of a respiratory lung pandemic. Pollution in the atmosphere increases that significantly. So the regulation says not only let's destroy the environment, but let's poison Americans in the middle of it by making the respiratory disease worse. Who suffers from this? The people who live near the polluting plants, because they can't afford to live anywhere else. Who are they? Mostly Black, because of the legacy of racism. So this, everywhere you look, you find this. It's, again, this aspect of it is not being discussed, but should be. But as for why the European press is not focusing on the main issues, you'll have to tell me. They're very serious. I mean, the pandemic is a very serious affair. We should be asking why it came at all. If we don't get to the roots of the reason why it's here, it will recur in a harsher form. Scientists are telling us right now exactly what they did in 2003 after the SARS epidemic, that another pandemic is coming, probably a coronavirus, could be worse than this one, exacerbated by global warming. And they know, telling us exactly what we have to do about it. We didn't do it in 2003. We have to do it now, and that is barely being discussed. Meanwhile, the Arctic ice sheets are melting. That's inexorable. There's undermining of the huge glaciers in the West Antarctic. We're on a course which, within a generation or two, will make most of the habitable world almost unlivable. The large parts of South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, all of this is taking place. And meanwhile, most countries are doing at least something about it. Not enough, but something. The Trump administration, alone among the developed societies, is racing toward the abyss as rapidly and enthusiastically as it can. More use of fossil fuels, including the most polluting of them, eliminating regulations on emissions, on automotive emissions. In fact, some of what's going on is almost indescribable. I'll give you one example. One of the Trump administration bureaucracies, National Transportation Administration, a year or so ago, published a detailed environmental assessment, a couple hundred pages, detailed analysis of what's happening to the environment. They predicted that if we continue on our current course, by the end of the century, global temperatures will have risen 4 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels. That's cataclysm. And they make a recommendation that we eliminate emissions controls on automobiles. Understand? Yeah. We're heading for total catastrophe, so therefore let's eliminate the controls that are mitigating it to some extent. If there's a document like this in human history, I'd like to see it. The only thing that comes to mind to me is the Wannsee Declaration. But that doesn't compare in evil to this. Hitler was saying, let's kill all the Jews and 30 million Slavs, Roma and others. He didn't say, let's destroy organized human society. But that's what they're saying. Do you have a headline about that?
No. Yes, and so 2020, there is probably the most crucial election in human history. Do you think we can actually make a change? Will there be a change?
It's very uncertain. If you look at polls, it seems that Trump is far behind, but that's quite misleading. First of all, polls are not voters. Voters are a skewed segment of the polls. We don't know what they'll do. Trump, and we also have, remember, the Electoral College in the United States. It's in 2016, Trump lost the popular vote by about 3 million, but won the Electoral College. All that's necessary is a few selected counties and a few states might swing the Electoral College. There's also a serious question being raised at the highest level as to whether, if Trump loses the Electoral College, he will leave office.
Yes.
That's a question not out at the fringe. It's being raised right at the highest level. This is not a normal person. This is not a person of the kind who has ever been seen in Western parliamentary systems. Maybe Hitler was one. This is another one. If he loses the Electoral College, he's perfectly capable of saying the vote was faked, there were illegal immigrants voting, we're going to stay here, I'm calling out my armed militias to protect the White House. Then what happens depends on the military. And that's why what happened this morning is not insignificant. He's purging the military, trying to at least, of all but Trump loyalists. I think there's a reason for that. They're thinking of these possibilities. It may sound exotic. Unfortunately, it's not. Even the Democratic presidential candidate said, if we have to take him out of the White House, we'll do it by force. We're not talking about something out at the fringe.
Well, do you think that the Bernie Sanders movement will probably influence this? It's a broad and a youthful movement in a way. Will they be capable of making a contribution to the outcome of this election?
It's happening. The Sanders and his associates have begun to engage in the Democratic National Committee program, and they have shifted the program quite far to the left. In fact, if you take a look at Biden's program, it's the most progressive of any Democratic candidate, probably since FDR. So they're influencing the program. The activists are making a difference. If they continue, that's crucial. If they don't go home, if they continue, that can have an effect. Public opinion can't be disregarded, even in a dictatorship, and we're very far from a dictatorship. So yes, they're having an effect, can have a greater effect, but we're coming to a very severe problem. I should say in the background is something different. If none of this was happening, if there was no Trump, if the country was continuing on the normal parliamentary course, it would still be facing a serious constitutional crisis, a very serious one. The US Constitution in the 18th century was a progressive document. Even the phrase "we the people" was a very impressive move. The U.S. What was called a revolution terrified European statesmen. King George III of England said it'll erode the whole British Empire. The Tsar and Metternich warned about the rise of this threat of republicanism, which will destroy all civilized society. Well, that was the 18th century. To adhere to an 18th century constitution today is very regressive. If the United States were to try to enter the European Union with its current constitutional structure, it would be turned down by the European Court of Justice, almost certainly. The Senate, which is the most powerful part of the parliament, is radically undemocratic. The state of Wyoming, with 500,000 people, has 2 senators. California, with 40 million people, has 2 senators. This affects the electoral college as well, skews the electoral college towards the smaller states. Beyond that, there are demographic changes. And so it turns the votes, there's an increasing urbanization, but that's not affected by the voting. It means that rural area, and there's plenty of gerrymandering, and you'll notice the Republican Party is working overtime to try to prevent voting. They're very much afraid of voting, because what they're hoping for and what the constitutional crisis is leading to is that a small part of the population, maybe 15 or 20%, mostly rural, conservative, Christian, white supremacist, elderly, that sector could actually govern the country the way the constitutional system is set up. And there's nothing that can be done about it. The only way to change it would be by constitutional amendments. And the smaller states will never have enough votes to prevent that. So there's quite a serious constitutional crisis coming.
What about the GOP, the grand old party, the Republicans? They're considered dead. You consider them the most dangerous organization of the world.
The Republican Party ceased to be a normal parliamentary party quite a few years ago. Not my opinion. Some of the leading political analysts from the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, Norman Ornstein, Thomas Mann, have wrote years ago that the Republican Party has become, in their words, a radical insurgency which does not observe parliamentary programs. We saw that very clearly when Obama was elected. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, not at the moment, 2 years later, Mitch McConnell, the Republican Majority Leader of the Senate, announced openly that the sole goal of the Senate will be to prevent Obama from doing anything. Okay? That's the end of the kind of trust and good faith on which democracy rests. The Republicans have put through probably 30 or so efforts to try to overthrow the Affordable Care Act. Right now, in the midst of a pandemic, they are supporting a suit in the courts to eliminate the health system. I mean, this is not a normal political party. This is a group of extreme reactionaries who know that they're a minority and are doing everything they can to hold on to power. You take a look at the Senate under McConnell the last couple of years. It blocks all legislative proposals that come from the House. The way the system works, legislative proposals come from the South, House, considered by the Senate and joint meetings to act on. They're all blocked. None are looked at even. What the Senate is doing is two things: passing legislation to enrich the very rich and the corporate sector, like the tax bill and the new bills that are passing right now, and stuffing the judiciary from top to bottom with young, ultra-right lawyers who will be able to block any legislation for a generation that departs from their ultra-reactionary position. They are trying to destroy the functioning democratic system, because if they try to survive within it, they will never win another election. In
What
fact,
about
Trump himself said
yeah.
openly, if we allow mail voting, Republicans will never be elected again because too many people will vote.
Right. What about the role of the media? You once said Trump and Murdoch cooperate in this destruction of the United States as well as the world.
The Murdoch system includes primarily Fox News, major television channel, plus lots of others. So the talk radio, the radio that people listen to when they're at home or driving, has been totally taken over by extreme far-right groups, which are even to the right of Fox News. There's a major camp, but Fox News itself has a very interesting relationship with President Trump. Fox is the news source, the main news source, almost the only news source for most Republicans in studies on this. Fox News is an echo chamber for the White House. If Trump says the coronavirus is just flu, Fox News announces coronavirus is just flu, don't worry about it. If Trump was to announce tomorrow that the world is flat, Sean Hannity will say, greatest discovery in human history. Furthermore, but that's only half of it. Trump doesn't pay attention to the news. He doesn't pay attention to intelligence reports. In the morning, he turns on Fox News, and that tells him what to say, what's on Fox News. So there's a dyad, a kind of a mutual echo chamber, which is what the Republican constituency watches. And that's why you have the results that you have. So take, say, global warming. It's the most serious challenge that humans have ever faced, except for nuclear war. 22% of Republicans think that humans have some role in global warming. 22%. About the same percentage think it's a problem that is important to deal with. I mean, we're living in a world which is, what's happening in the most important country in the world is shocking. And Europe is just as bad. They're doing nothing about it, just kowtowing to the power in Washington. I mentioned one thing, it's true on everything else. They don't have to. Europe could be a force in world affairs.
So in this terrible arena, what actually gives you hope? Is there is an attempt for a Green Deal, New Deal. There are youngsters on the move. There are even gangsters in Brazil who do what the president is obviously not capable for doing it for his citizens. Cuban doctors go to Italy. So there are obviously signs of encouraging aspects. What do you see as a hope in a kind of sustainable sense of the word?
Exactly that. And it's very substantial. The Black Lives Movement protests in the United States are very, they can reach very far to the social roots of racism, the institutional structures that lie behind the racism, the deep racism of the last several hundred years. And they are very broad. They affect the whole community, the whole society. Take the Green New Deal, which you mentioned. A couple of years ago, nobody was discussing it. A group of young activists, Sunrise Movement, were pressing very hard for it. They finally occupied congressional offices. They got some support from the new young congresswomen who came in on the Trump wave, also from a Democratic senator in Massachusetts, Ed Markey. Now it's in the center of the legislative program. Some form of Green New Deal, one or another form, is essential for survival. Now that shows what can be done. As I mentioned, the Sanders movement has been pressing and succeeding in moving the Democratic Party programs well towards a social democratic side. And we should recognize that what's called the Sanders Revolution in Europe would be considered mild social democracy. Now take a look at Sanders' two major programs, which are considered revolutionary in the United States. They're radical programs. Universal health care. You heard of a country that has it? You heard of a country that doesn't have it? Free higher education. Ever hear of a country that had it? Now, those are considered so radical that we don't know if the American people can tolerate. Sanders is moving with a lot of the population behind him. He's probably the most popular political figure in the country, towards a kind of social justice, social democracy, extension of the New Deal, programs that Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't have been surprised by. It's a sign of the sharp shift to the right of the political echelon, not the public, during the neoliberal period. And now that's being reversed. That's a sign of real hope. Similar things are happening in Europe. The Progressive International, which was just announced a couple of weeks ago, have its first major meeting in September in Iceland, where the Prime Minister is a member. This is initiated by the Sanders campaign in the United States, by Yanis Varoufakis and the G25 movement in Europe, transnational movement, bringing in voices from the global south. If that can get off the ground, could be a major counterforce to the developments that are taking place, to the efforts by those who created this system to try to perpetuate it. Now, that's a conflict which is very significant at the moment. How it turns, it's kind of almost, you could almost call it a class conflict on the international scale. How that turns out will determine whether organized human society can survive.
Now, the virus was considered the great, or is sometimes presented as the great equalizer between rich and poor. In fact, the poor pay a terrible price in it. Now, we see the governments around the world trying to have programs in trillions of dollars. What will that make in this process that is ahead of us?
Well, first of all, it may be called a great equalizer, but it is the opposite. And so if you take a look at the impact on, I don't know the European figures, but in the United States, take a look at the figures on inequality. They've risen. The people who are gaining from the crisis are billionaires, private equity firms, hedge funds, Amazon. They're gaining tens of billions of dollars. In fact, there was just a study during the pandemic, some tax revisions were taking place presumably to deal with the pandemic. It turns out that 80% of the gains from the tax changes go to people who make a salary, an income of more than $1 million a year. That's the Great Equalizer. And meanwhile, as I mentioned, pollution controls are being eliminated, which will increase the pandemic, the respiratory crisis, among people living near polluting plants, black and poor. That's the Great Equalizer. People in power know what they're doing. They're not in favor of providing the poor and vulnerable people with gifts. They're in favor of providing gifts for themselves. If they can get away with it, it's not going to be a great equalizer. So the question is how the public will respond to these developments. And we're back to where we were. There are steps towards it, but it's going to be a battle.
Now, Noam, just two final little questions. A crucial point will be, or is considered here, the choice of the running mate for Biden. Whom do you have in mind? There are several black women that are suggested to us. Do you have a guess for us?
My guess doesn't mean much, but off the cuff, I would guess it's very likely he will pick Kamala Harris. But I don't know. My guess doesn't mean anything, so don't pay attention to it.
May I add a very personal question? 4 years ago, we sat together and against the two of us, Valeria, your wife, predicted the success of Donald Trump in this presidential election. Does Valeria have an idea for the outcome this year?
Larry is the only person I know who predicted the Trump victory in 2016. She's not here, but I'll have to quote her. Her current prediction is that Trump will lose the election. So since she has a perfect record so far, maybe she's right. However, bear in mind what I said before and what people in high places up to the Democratic Party candidate are saying.
Yes.
If he loses the election, that's not necessarily the end.
Right. Now, we have a few questions. People come in with questions. Let me just take one. Okay. Talk about globalization. Do you think the rampant spread of the coronavirus will be regarded as a downside of globalization and therefore lead to a global counter-movement with more nationalized industrial production? What consequences would stem from this?
Well, first of all, globalization is a fine thing. Like the fact that you and I could be together 4 years ago, that's globalization. The question is, what form of globalization? Now, a particular form of globalization has been developed under the neoliberal model, which basically holds that decisions have to be in the hands of private, unaccountable power. That's the major principle of neoliberalism. Can be dressed up in other terms, but that's what it comes down to. When Ronald Reagan says government is the problem, not the solution, that means hand decisions, take decisions away from government, which has the flaw that it can be influenced by people, turn it over into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, corporations, in which people have no influence. That's how globalization was formed. What are called free trade agreements are in fact investor rights agreements. They have almost nothing to do with free trade. The form of globalization that was established was to try to maximize profit. And you maximize profit if you have no spare capacity. If you're running an automobile plant and you want to maximize profit, you make sure that you have no waste capacity, meaning no security. If anything goes wrong, well, you can fix up the assembly line. When you run a world like that, it's a disaster. The globalized system that was set up is extremely fragile. Anything goes wrong, collapses. In fact, we even see that in the health system. Compare Germany and the United States. Germany delayed on dealing with the pandemic, but it finally did it. Germany had spare capacity, diagnostic capacities, spare health capacities, it had a health system. It was able to reduce the number of deaths sharply. The United States had basically the same number of cases, still does, because the health system is run on a business model, strict neoliberal business model. No spare beds, no spare capacity, almost totally privatized health system, huge salaries. You're after profit, not support. Okay, so you have a catastrophe. Same with the globalized system. One thing that is very likely to happen is that there will be a shift towards less fragility and more security. I doubt if the corporate managers who run the world under the neoliberal system, if they prevail, nothing much different is going to change. Just less fragility, more security in how it runs.
There's a special attention given to a very American issue, that's weapon lobbyists. Can you imagine how these militant and violent actions enter the campaign of the election?
It's already entering. I don't know how much the news reaches you, but was there a report of what happened in Bethel, small village, Bethel, Ohio, about 2 weeks ago? Well, I'll tell you, in case it wasn't. It's now happening all over the Midwest. This is a small village, a couple thousand people, quiet village, 6 police officers. Nothing ever happens. A few people decided to have a small, peaceful march to support the protests, the nationwide protests on racism. The village was assaulted by about 700 or 800 militia troops, armed militias, smashing the place up, overwhelming the police force, driving people back to their homes, calling for, denouncing the protests and so on. This is happening all over the country. In the state of Wisconsin, these armed militia demonstrators actually took over the legislature. It's a serious phenomenon, and they're always, Trump is supporting them all the way. I should mention some statistics that were recently released. Take a look at terrorism in the United States, terrorism or threats of terrorism. Now, there isn't, it's not a huge amount, but it's substantial. If you go back to 2016, 20% of the terrorism and terrorism threats was connected to white supremacy. In 2018, it's 98%, and it increased in 2019. Now it's almost all of it. That's related to the tweets that you see coming out of the White House, which stimulate this. When the legislature was occupied in Wisconsin, Trump tweeted, "These are good people, very good people." You know about Charlottesville. It's always there. And he knows what he's doing. That's part of his constituency. and he's got a voting constituency. His actual constituency is the super rich and the corporate sector. All the legislation goes to serve them, but you have to have a voting constituency. You can't go to ask people to vote for you by telling them, I'm trying to undermine you and support the very rich. They're not going to vote for you that way. So you have to appeal on what are called cultural issues, religious extremism. 25% of the country is evangelical, so we'll throw them to things. White racism, white supremacy, the Second Amendment, which is a farce. I could go into that, but no, it's wholly rigged. You have to have your assault rifle with you when you go into a coffee shop, you know. So we'll appeal to them on that. And this is part of the support for the militias. And it's a serious phenomenon.
Yeah, we have seen in Tulsa at his campaign that people were standing there with guns at the entrance to this place, and they can actually openly wear them.
The law says you can carry guns openly.
Yeah.
I teach at the University of Arizona. When you come to the gate of the university, there's a sign saying, "No weapons allowed." Now that's a constant battle between the university and the state legislature, which wants to open the university to open carry of guns. In the state of Texas, that's already permitted. I have a friend an old friend, he's almost 100 years old, in an assisted living place way out in the suburbs. You go to visit him, nice house, home out in the suburbs with elderly people. But there's a sign on the door saying, "No weapons allowed." I mean, it's, you know, I mean, if you want to know the history, there's not much time, but I'll be very brief. The whole history is a con job. In the late 19th century, the gun manufacturers realized that they don't have a market for their fancy weapons. The Civil War was a great market. European wars were a great market, but it was declining. Nobody wanted the fancy weapons they produced. It was an agricultural society. Every farmer had a weapon, but it was like a shovel, you know. He wanted some old rifle to scare coyotes away. They wouldn't buy the fancy weapons. So they started the first huge public relations effort in history, a huge campaign to try to concoct fables about the Wild West, which never existed. You know, nowadays everybody sees them on cowboy movies. Never existed. The sheriff who's fast on the draw, you know, Wyatt Earp, the Lone Ranger, all of this stuff. I mean, I believed it when I was a kid. We used to play those games. It was all invented. And the subtext was, you have to buy your son a Winchester rifle or else he's not a real man. So guns started buying all over the place. That was bad enough. Then came 2008, the most reactionary Supreme Court in modern history, changed the meaning of the Second Amendment. If you read the Second Amendment, it says, in order to establish a well-ordered militia, the right to hold guns shall not be infringed. That was the 18th century, and they had reasons for it. One is they were afraid the British were coming for good reasons. They were the big power, and there was almost no standing army, so you needed Minutemen. The other was they were invading the Indian country. That was part of the reasons for the Revolutionary War. To be able to invade the West, you needed guns. Thirdly, it was slavery. There were slave revolutions. You needed guns. And those were the reasons why the founders wanted guns and a militia. And that's for 100 years. The court decision was having guns was connected to a militia right. That was reversed in 2008. The Scalia decision said it's an individual right, nothing to do with militias. That turned the Second Amendment into holy writ. And now if you ask most people what's in the Constitution, the only thing they'll know is the Second Amendment, which is our right carry an assault rifle when we go into a coffee shop. The judgment is astonishing. It mentions none of the reasons why the founders established the Second Amendment. These are supposed to be originalists, you know, people who observe the original text and meaning of the terms for the founders. Not in this case, not a mention. Just let's make individual rights to guns a holy writ. And you'll notice that every time Trump issues a tweet supporting some action, he says, you have to defend your Second Amendment rights, even if that has absolutely nothing to do with it. Why? Because that's the rallying cry. That's the way you get your voters together to vote for you, even when you're stabbing them in the back. It's a very effective trick. It's confidence, it's called. And I'm afraid I have another.
Thank you very much. And thanks also to Valeria for her keeping a strict regime on your health.
Okay.
We are all very grateful for you sort of participating in this, and thank you very much for your generous time.
Okay. Good to see you. I hope we'll be able to make it in person one of these days.
Yes, hopefully.
Yep, bye.
Thank you.